This is the beginning of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, the way this attitude formed around our women and the way that we were traded, for example. There's a notion in Canadian history of country wives, like every single 12 and 13-year-old First Nations girl was just sitting around waiting to get married to some smelly European man that was like 3 or 4 times her age. It's just ridiculous to me how we've got this romantic notion in Canada of what our past was like when the reality was something far, far different.
Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart.
Over the past year, we've had so many brilliant guests on the podcast. For the first couple weeks of January, we decided to revisit some of our favorites from 2024. This week, we have an encore presentation of our conversation with award-winning journalist and author, Tanya Talaga. Her book, The Knowing, is a deeply personal and meticulously researched account of Canada's past. We discuss intergenerational trauma, healing, and how history reverberates in our current realities. Hi, Tanya. It's so good to see you.
Hi, Tamara.
So your new book is out. Here it is. Book number 3, right?
Book number 3.
Wow.
I know.
The Knowing. I know what the knowing means because I've, read the book, but why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us, what does the knowing mean?
So every Indigenous family, we have people in our family that are just gone, that are missing. Be it residential schools, tuberculosis, sanitaria, asylums, be it Indian hospitals. Indian hospitals are, if you're unfamiliar, they were throughout Canada until the late 1990s. We all lost family to these places. And the thing is that so many of our families have told our stories down through the generations of an Uncle Leon that didn't come home from Indian residential school, of an Auntie Clara that we never saw again when she went to the Indian hospital. There are all of these stories, and we all just kind of keep going and move on. And sometimes we just don't know what happened to those people, right? And to me, that has always been something that my family has lived with, and I know every single other First Nation family has lived with as well. And that is the knowing. When I was in Kamloops at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, right after the announcement of the 215, it was the people of Kamloops Teshwapma that came out with a press advisory, actually, and it said, we have always known there are folks missing. There are children that never came home. And we call this the knowing. So the knowing is a marriage of both of those things.
Yeah. Kamloops, I'm in BC. And I will never forget that day and that announcement. And it's, and to hear the stories from people in Kamloops, Indigenous people, who they knew.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Had been, these stories, because it's, the storytelling is so important because, it's not, it's only until recently we could look things up on the internet and find out something, or go to Ancestry, or something like that, or do a DNA test or whatever it might be. There's lots of different things we can do now. But these are stories that have happened since the beginning of time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about Annie?
So Annie was my great-great-grandmother, and my mom has been trying to find her. So she's my mom's great-grandma forever. My mother moved to Toronto as a young woman, and she left her community of Fort William First Nation. She was living on the traditional territory of Fort William when she married my father, and she found herself in Toronto, and she knew that her great-grandma had been taken to Toronto, but that's all she knew, and that she had died in Toronto, and she didn't know where she was buried. And my mom has always talked about Annie and finding Annie. And, sometimes time goes by and I would talk to her about Annie and who she was and what happened to her. And then we would just kind of leave it and push it aside because I just didn't know where to start or what to do, how to look for her. And my mother gave me this folder, and it was after my Uncle Hank died. Hank was Annie's grandson. He had a folder that had all of this information. It had birth certificates, it had death certificates, and it had baptism records. And I had no idea who any of these people were. And in there, he had one death certificate for Annie, and Annie Gauthier. And that was all we had about Annie. And from there, I set out to try and find her. And you'll say, well, why is she so important? Why do you want to know about her? Well, she was one of the people that were missing in our family. And my Uncle Hank and my mom, they had so many questions about the women in our family and how come they never talked. Annie's daughter, Liz, raised my mom. She was my mom's grandma. She was Hank's mother. And she never spoke about who she was, where she was from. She never spoke her language. She didn't like to tell anyone that she was Cree. We actually didn't even know she was Cree until I found Annie, Liz's mom. And it has been just a journey to retrace the steps of women in our family and what happened to them after the birth, quote unquote, of the Indian Act, the passing of the Indian Act in 1876. Annie was born 5 years before the passing of a racist piece of legislation that is still on the books today, the Indian Act. And she was born just a few years after Rupert's Land was, quote unquote, sold to Sir John A. Macdonald so the government of Canada could build the country. And so to me, finding Annie, who was from this pivotal period in time and who lived through clearly the mouth of genocide, was so important because maybe she could answer some questions as to who our family was.
You mentioned the Indian Act. The beginning of your book, I think it's in the acknowledgments. I can't remember where, but somewhere in it you write that you're angry. And I like it when people, own their anger. We have reason to be angry. And a lot of people don't know what the Indian Act is. And on this podcast, it must have been like a year or 2 years ago, I interviewed Bob Joseph, who wrote
Best book ever. Yeah.
Well, besides the knowing, no, but Bob wrote this book, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. I tell everybody to buy this book. You should keep this book close to hand. You won't believe this book. And this book it's the Indian Act.
Yes. Explained.
Simply explained. And as I mentioned, you said but you're angry. You're angry about the Indian Act. And can we just talk a little bit about your thoughts on the Indian Act? For anybody who's listening who is like, oh, okay, I don't know who Bob Joseph is or that book or what the Indian Act is, because so many people who live in this country don't know what it is or the fact that we still have the Indian Act.
That's true. Yeah. So the Indian Act, as I mentioned, was passed in 1876, and it truly is a racist, paternalistic piece of legislation. And it is the government of Canada's list, so to speak, list of people who they deem to be, quote unquote, Indian. That is the term of the day. That's the term under the Act. And so that's why I'm using that word. And for the longest time, until the government of Canada passed legislation correcting it, First Nations communities could not decide who members of their own community were. It was the government of Canada who decided who was Indian and who was not. And thankfully, that has changed. Communities can apply to Canada to be the holders of their own membership. But the Indian Act, for over 100 years, 150 years, has been this piece of legislation that confines us. It keeps us othered from the rest of the Canadian population. There's a different set of rules. There was a different set of schools, the Indian residential schools. It was against the law under the Indian Act to not send your children to an Indian residential school. The Indian Act forbade Indians, quote unquote, from going to university, from gathering in large groups, from hiring a lawyer. It banned potlatch ceremonies and all other ceremonies that were integral to who we are as a people. The Indian Act is a tool of assimilation. It is not something the Canadian government has done because they're happy about lots of Indigenous people being there and let's write all their names down and, what people think is give us things. It's not how it goes. So that's the Indian Act in a nutshell. But you're right. Bob Joseph's book is a really good, quick reference as to finding out more. I'll say one more thing about the Indian Act, and it always sort of surprises people. If you were a status Indian, if you are a status Indian in Canada, which means you fall under the Indian Act, you did not receive the right to vote until 1960.
That's right.
That's huge.
Not very long ago. I feel like we've come a long way in the last little while when it comes to educating our kids about residential schools, truth and reconciliation, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Why haven't we abolished the Indian Act? It sounds so simple to say that. And I know it must not be a simple thing to just say, we're not going to have this anymore.
It's not a simple thing at all. And I was involved in a conference a few years back. Oh my goodness, probably 7 years back now, about life after the Indian Act. And it was called Determination. And it was held in Ottawa. It was a gathering. And we all, like Indigenous leaders, professors, lawyers, politicians, artists, got together to imagine a world without the Indian Act, what that would look like. We have to tell the government of Canada what we want in place of the Indian Act. And that is up to us to do as a people. And it definitely isn't up to the government of Canada to say, we're going to replace it with something like this. The Indian Act, it's quite interesting too. We have all of these layers of government. Like we've got the Department of, well, they call it Indigenous Services Canada now, and Crown Indigenous Relations. So those are two federal government departments that have thousands of people working for it. Those are government jobs, government salaries, right? And they prop up the Indian Act.
Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah. Let's go back to Annie, because I want to talk about Annie, and finding Annie, and missing Annie. And I mean, sometimes when I'm reading a book, I don't know if you ever do this. I go right to the end. Sometimes. But I read mostly nonfiction, so I feel like that's okay to go to the end of the book. But I did go to the end with yours when I first started reading it, and I'm glad I did because it made me laugh. And and you said, humor is or laughing is important. And
it's integral. Yeah, we're funny people.
And so I won't ruin the end of the book for anybody, but there is just a funny, also sad, meaningful and powerful moment at the end of your book with your mom. So your Uncle Hank had this envelope, and obviously finding out about his ancestors was important to him too.
Yeah, it was totally. You know, my uncle was constantly trying to prove to the government of Canada that his mom Liz and his grandma Annie existed as people. The government of Canada said Liz, his mom, just simply didn't exist. They had no one in their records by the name of Liz Gauthier that was born, over the span of 10 years. And he knew his mom was alive. He knew that his mom was an Indigenous woman, a First Nations woman. But under the law, she wasn't recognized. And the reason why was because Gauthier wasn't her last name. It was actually Sampson. And that was something not recorded. It's complicated. She was baptized, and when she was baptized by the Roman Catholic Church, her last name was changed. Records are complicated, and records were also at the mercy of whoever writes down the records. And it wasn't until we found records of Liz's baptism, true baptism and birth in the early 20th century that we actually knew her last name was Sampson and not Gauthier. And that's something my Uncle Hank just couldn't know. Why was it important? Because the government of Canada told my Uncle Hank that he was Indian, but not Indian enough to be counted as a status Indian. So that means that his brothers and sisters and his children could not be counted as quote unquote Indian under the eyes of the law. And that's a pride thing too, right? I mean, when you tell somebody that you're not who you think you are, but he was a proud First Nations man, Anishinaabe man, and he was like, no, I know who I am. He was raised on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation, which is an Anishinaabe community. His father was an Anishinaabe trapper, and his mom, Liz, she just never spoke about where she was from or anything else, but she was definitely a First Nations woman. And Canada said, nope, she doesn't count. She doesn't matter. And so my Uncle Hank said, no, she does matter. And it's, you see throughout the book the knowing erasure of First Nations women under Canadian law. Our names weren't written down right. We weren't counted. If we married a white man, we were no longer considered an Indian. That's called enfranchisement. And that kicked out so many people from communities, from belonging, from who they are. It was a devastating concept.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A long time ago, I babysat for an Indigenous woman. She married a white man, and she lived one house outside of the reservation in North Vancouver. And I was 13, and I didn't understand why, and she told me. I was 13. I didn't know anything about anything. And we sure weren't being taught anything in school, I'll tell you that. Right? And so, people like me, I'm in my 50s. I am learning all of this as an adult, whereas my kids are coming home with books about residential school and telling me stories from inside the books, and it's so different. But you telling that story, and then me reflecting to when I was a little girl, I see the sadness now in that, right, for that woman and her family, and being just on the other side.
That's right. Yeah. Living on the cusp, like not really part of the community per se.
So when we we hear a lot about intergenerational trauma, and Annie, I keep coming back to Annie because the book it really is about finding Annie.
Yeah, it's a double narrative, that's for sure. It's, I go from the 215 because I was a journalist at the Toronto Star for a very long period of time. And then I went to the Globe and Mail, and it was as a columnist at the Globe that I received an email from Kamloops inviting me to come and to be one of the Indigenous reporters there covering the story of the 215. It was known as the 215 at the time, Les Weiwei, the missing. And so the book, The Knowing, goes back and forward in time. It follows Kamloops sort of to present day with all of the awakenings of our children's spirits and all of these communities across Canada where residential schools had children and where children died. We're trying now to find so many of these lost kids. And so the narrative of the book stretches out through Kamloops to present day and also goes back and forward telling Annie's story and what I'm finding as I search for Annie. And that is, I didn't know I was going to write the book like that.
I think that's what's so beautiful about the book is that, we're talking, the 215 are children, babies.
That's right.
Annie
was a woman. Yeah, she was a grown woman. Yeah.
And it's so there's that, right? And not knowing about
what happened to her and what happened to her children. Did she have other children besides Liz and Liz's younger half sister, Louise? I discovered that when she got married a second time, she was married at 38.
Oh, wow.
So I'm like, well, she probably had more children, right? She was probably married before. So I went looking and spent a lot of time looking for if she had any other children and who her first husband Samson was, and discovered she had 5 other children before Liz, my great-grandma, was born. And those children disappeared. What happened to them? One, the eldest, George, died of whooping cough when he was 5 or 6, but the rest vanished. And that is where we were looking too. What schools did they go to? Indian residential schools. And the one child I could find a lot of information on was Annie's daughter, Christina. And Christina was literally stolen from Annie in northern Ontario, just outside of between Thunder Bay and Sioux Lookout, where Annie was living at the time, and she was taken to an Indian residential school in Manitoba, near the Saskatchewan border. And Christina, you'll read about her in the book, but she doesn't make it home.
How hard was it for you, just for your heart, right, to write this book? This is, you write about everything that you write about. Makes me feel so sad, right? And so, but not in a bad way. I say that as with empathy, right? Like it's so tender what you're writing about.
Oh, thank you very much.
How do you hold that? How do you not feel that sadness all the time?
Well, it's born from a place of love. Really, it is. And, part of the reason why I wrote The Knowing was to show the immense beauty of the survival instinct of that incredible love that keeps us going as women. Annie's story is very much a story of women and survival, and how, all of our mothers, they really lived through crappy times. Like things are pretty good now. If you were a non-Indigenous woman, chances are life was also pretty hard. If you were an Indigenous woman, it was that tenfold. You were living in a society that wants to erase you, that doesn't write your name down properly, that takes away your children, your very identity. And then at the end, it took away Annie's life. It's the worst of the worst. And this is what happened to Indigenous women in Canada. And it's something we don't talk about a lot. And I was really struck by that. I was writing this book. I was like, well, this is the beginning of trafficking of our women. This is the beginning of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, the way this attitude formed around our women. and the way that we were traded, for example, like, there's a notion in Canadian history of country wives, like every single 12 and 13-year-old First Nations girl was just sitting around waiting to get married to some smelly European man that was like 3 or 4 times her age. It's just ridiculous to me how we've got this romantic notion in Canada of what our past was like, when the reality was something far, far different.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Annie was taken.
Mm-hmm. She was.
And she went to the Ontario hospital, was it?
That's right. Yes, every single province had a provincial hospital that was a quote unquote lunatic asylum.
Yes. And they were called that, I think, at some point.
Exactly, exactly. And you could be put into one of these places if you were going through menopause, if you were having an affair, if you were a child experiencing anxiety over your homework. I mean, it's unbelievable the list of reasons why you could be quote unquote committed. Not to mention if you were a problem woman, right? Or maybe someone who didn't conform to what society wanted, or a woman who'd been through severe trauma and had 5 of her children taken away, and her husband died. Well, that would be very traumatic, right? Um, and the Ontario Hospital is where Annie was put. We have no idea why. We can't find anything on that. And that happened in 1930. And she was there for 7 years, 8 months, and 28 days. And she died there and was buried in an unmarked grave. And this grave is, believe it or not, right off of the Gardiner Expressway, the Queen Elizabeth Way in Toronto, which is one of the biggest highways in the city. And if you're leaving the center of Toronto to get to the airport, you drive right by Annie's grave. It's mind-boggling. And
like, how many times you have driven by there, your family has driven by there over, right?
I can't even count how many times. And the fact that she's been lying there since 1937 with no headstone, it's the size of a city block. And there are actually 1,511 people buried in the Ontario Hospital graveyard. It's a massive number. And of that, only 10% have grave markers.
Yeah, it's the same with the same type of hospital here in BC that only shut down in the late 90s. Those hospitals were horrific for everybody. They were horrific, and yeah. Anyways, well, I could talk forever about those hospitals. I have lots of lots of thoughts on that. I do want to mention that we always ask our guests to pick suggest a Canadian nonprofit, and you chose the Spirit to Soar Fund. Thank you for choosing them. We're going to make a donation in your name as a thank you for having this conversation with me. So the Spirit to Soar Fund, thank you very much. And I know, well, we're wrapping things up, and I could talk to you forever about your book. And I do hope everybody, it is such a, tender is the only word I can come up with, because there's so much meaning in this book. And I think it's something that everybody can take something from. Where do we go from here, Tanya? Like, where do we go from here as non-Indigenous people, Indigenous people, women raising their own children? How are we all allies? How are we all moving in the same direction?
It's a beautiful question. I appreciate that. First, I'll say that I think every Canadian needs to get behind making sure that the efforts that have begun to find our missing loved ones, our missing children and relations, First Nations relations, Indigenous relations, continues. The Indian residential school system, the Indian hospital system was not something that we asked for, and it was a definite othering in our country. It's actually a crime against humanity, according under Canada, all of the conventions that Canada has signed on the international level. And so, in order for Canada to make amends with the world for signing conventions from the United Nations and so forth, we have to support the finding of our children and our lost relations. It's good for Canada. It's good for all of us to tell the truth as to what has happened here. And as for all women, I hope people read The Knowing and see the strength of women in general, of mothers in general, of your grandmas and your great grandmas and your great great grandmas, and all the stuff they lived through just so you could sit there and have a microphone and like talk to me. I think that we all need to take a pause too and remember those women. And they were complicated, they were wonderful, and boy, did they lead lives. And I think all of us should, as you suggested, find out more about everyone in our family and write it down and tell the story.
Yeah, beautiful. The book is called The Knowing. Tanya, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for being here. Really, it's been, you were a dream. So thank you. You are on Twitter, or X, I guess as it's called now. Nobody's calling it. We all still call it Twitter.
I know. We also call it Twitter. I know.
You are at Tanya Talaga, and that's
right.
Talaga. And you are also on Instagram at Tanya Talaga _author. Thank you so much.
I appreciate all of your questions, and I loved speaking with you, Tamara. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.